Right. Good morning, everyone. We're gonna give people a few minutes to jump in here. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in another minute or two once we reach critical mass. We'll get started in 1 minute. Right. I think we've hit critical mass, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's webinar. This is the first of 2 rollout webinars to introduce the second report and recommendations within that report for the Oyster Best Management Practice Expert Panel recommendations. Before we get started, I just want to go through a few quick housekeeping items. This is a webinar format, so all participants are muted automatically. If you need to use the closed captioning feature, that has been enabled, so you should be able to turn that on the Zoom toolbar. We are also recording this webinar, and the recorded link will be posted to the Bay Program event calendar page, along with the slides that we're presenting today, and all the other materials that are currently available for review. Please enter your questions for the speakers into the Q&A throughout the webinar. We will have a dedicated question and answer time at the end of the talk. So the goal of today's agenda is to provide an update and an overview of the Oyster BMP panel process, membership charge, and a summary of the panel's activities over the past several years. We're also going to be specifically focusing on providing a more detailed overview of the panel's recommendations for the enhanced denitrification component of this report, which is one out of three major components to the report. The next two components will be discussed at next week's webinar on the 14th. Please note that there are several appendices for this report that have additional detail that we won't have time to go over today. However, I do encourage people who are interested in viewing those details to refer to those appendices while you're also reviewing the main report. Also note that there is a technical appendix that has information specific to the watershed model. That's still under development, and that will be released shortly and also be posted on the Bay Program webpage with all the other materials for review. So this webinar kicks off the second phase of the BMP protocol process. So we're in the partnership and review and comment period now, and this will be open till March 10th. We are going to be then seeking approval by stakeholders, so you all who are attending, the watershed technical work groups, and ultimately the water quality and fisheries goal implementation teams. The goal here is to have the recommendations for the BMPs that the panel has provided in this report to be added to the modeling tools for improving water quality in the Chesapeake Bay. Before we get into the content for today's webinar, I want to also go over a few important dates. The report is now available for review. It is posted on the Bay Program events calendar page for this webinar. So please review all the materials there. We will also be having a second webinar, which will be held next Tuesday, exactly a week from now at the same time, 11 a.m. And then lastly, I just want to point your attention to the feedback period closes on March 10th. And please submit all your written feedback to the email oysterbmpresponse@oysterrecovery.org. That is where we're going to be compiling all the information that we receive. Okay, so again, this is the first webinar for the second Oyster Best Management Practice Expert Panel report. And we're going to be focusing specifically on one component of three in this report today. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to introduce myself. I'm Olivia Coretti. I am serving as the panel coordinator for the Oyster BMP Expert Panel, and I am the Coastal Restoration Program Manager at Oyster Recovery Partnership. I also want to introduce our second speaker, Jeff Cornwell, who is the panel chair, and he has led this effort through the past several years. Jeff is a marine biogeochemist at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science at Horn Point Lab. So before we get started, I just want to give Jeff a moment to provide any overarching comments.
Yeah, this whole process really predates what we're doing here by a good measure. The general idea that oysters are good for water quality has been around for a very long time. The hard part has always been attaching the science sufficient so that we actually have quantification of those numbers. In about 10 to 15 years ago, efforts in New England and North Carolina got things started off in parallel with what got started in the Chesapeake Bay. Lisa Kellogg, now at VIMS, worked with us on some of the early best rates for what restored oyster communities can do in terms of removing nitrogen through the process of microbial denitrification. And that evolved, and the other thing that's happened, and the reason this is really going on, is there's large-scale restoration going on in Maryland and Virginia to deploy lots of oysters. The kind of effort it takes to quantify this really fits best into that broad public investment by NOAA, the Corps of Engineers, and the states of Maryland and Virginia to deploy a lot of oysters and get the benefits from them. So the whole point of this really is to get a quantification of the benefits of oysters for water quality. This is one of the three components that Olivia mentioned. And so we'll walk you through both the management and sort of the base scientific components of this that lead us to where we are now, where we would propose that this can be considered a best management practice. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. All right. So with that, just to review, everyone here is probably familiar with these best management practices. These are essentially methods that are the most effective and practical way to prevent or reduce nutrient and sediment in the Chesapeake Bay to help achieve water quality goals. To date, there are hundreds of individual BMPs that have been approved by the Bay program and that are being utilized in some capacity to help meet those water quality standards. And oysters are just one of these. BMPs are one of several tools that the Bay program uses in their modeling framework to determine progress towards meeting the total maximum daily load requirements in the Chesapeake Bay. So a few examples are listed here in this diagram. Oysters are inherently linked to water quality since they directly filter particles such as sediment and algae from the water column. So oysters can improve water clarity directly by filtering those particles. Oysters can also sequester nutrients in their tissue and shell as they're growing. Oysters deposit nutrients in biodeposits, which can then be buried in an estuary. And then lastly, oysters can enhance biogeochemical processes that transform nutrients into biologically unavailable compounds. So for example, microbes that are associated with oysters can denitrify nitrogen into nitrogen gas, which is then permanently removed from the system as it's off-gassed into the atmosphere. So through filtration, oysters can significantly contribute to biogeochemical cycling in estuaries. And this obviously has implications for improving water quality specific to the Chesapeake Bay. So because of this, there was a history of interest, as Jeff mentioned, in investigating whether and how oysters could be applied as BMPs. In response to this interest, the Oyster BMP expert panel was convened in 2015. And on the slide here, just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the work that has gone into this process, specifically acknowledging the current panel members and advisors and coordinators that are contributing to this work, but also want to take a moment to thank all of the panel members who have moved on from the panel and who have provided data, additional scientists who have provided data to support this effort, support from the Bay program, the modelers, and additional staff who have supported the Oyster BMP process over the past several years. And just want to also emphasize that this is a multi-stakeholder, multi-collaborative effort. So once the panel was convened, they were tasked with three main charges. The first is to identify and define oyster practices for BMP consideration. The second was to develop a decision framework for the incremental approval of oyster BMPs. And then lastly, the panel was tasked with developing recommendations on nutrient and sediment reduction through oyster practices based on existing science. So in their first report, the panel published their decision framework for incremental approval of oyster BMPs. So just briefly, the decision framework goes through four main steps. The first is the panel determines oyster practices and crediting protocols or mechanisms by which oysters are removing nutrients for evaluation. So the panel asked, does an enhancement activity increase oyster production? The second step was to determine the reduction effectiveness estimates, or essentially a number or a rate of reduction, and the equation or method to calculate that estimate. based on current scientific understanding. And this is key to this whole process is, do sufficient data exist to help calculate these rates and also support the calculation of those rates? The next step is to provide verification guidelines. So does a practical method exist, or can one be created to track a reduction in nutrients or sediment? And then lastly, the panel worked to identify any unintended consequences, positive or negative, and determine if they could be addressed. So again, this was published in the panel's first report, which was approved in 2016. The panel also identified and defined 12 oyster practices as part of their first report. And these oyster practices were defined based on things like the fate of an oyster. So was it removed from the water, or does it remain in the water? The fisheries management approach, who has access to oysters, the type of oysters, and the activities or the enhancement activities that are associated with each of these different categories. So for the first report, the panel defined all of these practices, but they really focused on evaluating and providing recommendations on practices associated with oyster aquaculture. Through this phase of the panel's effort, and what's in the second report is the panel evaluated and provided recommendations for oyster activities associated with licensed oyster harvest practices and oyster reef restoration practices. So this table that I'm showing you on the screen is the second table in the report for reference, and you can read more about that in the text. So again, the panel is really focusing on providing recommendations for 3 main oyster practices in this new report. The first is licensed oyster harvest using hatchery-produced oysters. And essentially what this means is that there's an enhancement activity where oysters from the hatchery are planted on the bottom and then later removed through fishery. The second and third practices are related to oyster reef restoration. The first being restoration using hatchery-produced oysters. So planting oysters from hatchery on the bottom or on a suitable substrate to enhance oyster biomass in an area where harvest is not allowed. And then the third practice is oyster reef restoration using substrate addition. So essentially planting shell or some alternate material that's suitable for enhancing oyster recruitment to an area where oysters are not allowed to be removed. So today we're going to be focusing specifically on the last two practices for oyster reef restoration. The panel also identified several oyster-associated processes or mechanisms where oysters are removing nutrients from the water column. We're calling these in the report reduction effectiveness protocols. So the panel came up with 8 of these protocols, again, mechanisms where oysters are removing nutrients from the water column. And in this report, the panel is specifically providing evaluations and recommendations for 5 of those processes or 5 of those protocols. And generally, these are through the assimilation of nitrogen and phosphorus into oyster tissue and shell as oysters are growing. And then the second main category is through promoting enhanced denitrification associated with oysters. And that'll be the focus of today's talk. Before we get into more details, I also just want to add that one major decision that allowed the panel to even evaluate oyster restoration practices for BMP consideration was that the EPA decided that the reduction of nutrients and sediment via filtration was acceptable under the Clean Water Act. And Appendix C specifically talks about that decision by the EPA. I also just want to note that the panel's work would not have moved forward without this designation. So this was a really key step in the panel's process. Okay, so this is a lot, but essentially what I want to convey here is that the panel evaluated these 12 oyster practices and these 8 oyster protocols and created a matrix to help guide their evaluation and recommendation process for a whole set of these combinations. And this is the first table in the report, so you can reference that there. As part of their first report, the panel evaluated 10 oyster practice protocol combinations highlighted in dark gray, and they submitted recommendations for 6 of those, and those have been approved. As part of this effort, the panel reviewed a total of 45 practice protocol combinations and are providing recommendations for 12. So this, was a really large undertaking by the panel and required a lot of understanding of scientific data and literature that was available to them. So with all the combinations of practices and protocols that the Oyster BMP expert panel has evaluated, they're essentially pushing forward 4 elements to the Oyster BMP toolset. One of those has been approved in the first report in 2016, which is just to summarize, essentially oyster aquaculture practices, removing nutrients through assimilation into oyster tissue. This new report has 3 main components to it. The first is that we're going to be talking about today is restoration practices and oysters removing nutrients through enhanced denitrification, specifically nitrogen. This report also talks about oyster restoration practices whereby nutrients are removed through assimilating nitrogen and phosphorus into their tissue and shell. And then lastly, oyster harvest practices where nutrients are removed through assimilation into oyster tissue, and then those oysters are removed from the water. So this set of 4 components to the Oyster BMP toolset is very comprehensive, but today we're really going to be focusing on restoration denitrification recommendations. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to provide more details about this specific practice protocol combination set.
So what you see circled here is the process of denitrification, and the term actually is exactly what it is. It's removing nitrogen from the system through a series of microbial processes in this case. And we'll describe that a little bit in the next few slides. And so what you're looking at here on the left hand of this panel is what happens in any aquatic environment for denitrification. This is not necessarily specific to oysters. This is occurring broadly in the Chesapeake Bay, in the shallows and in the deep when there's not anoxia. And so what happens is that the nitrogen and algae and other particulates, when it settles to the bottom, is remineralized to ammonium. Ammonium under aerobic conditions turns into nitrate, at least part of it. And that nitrate is what fuels denitrification. The nitrate can come either from the water column or for this coupled process of producing nitrate through nitrification. And so it's really, when you think about what's happening in an oyster reef or oysters in general, they are filtering particles out of the water. Some of them are ejecting into pseudofeces, some of them they're going through the animal's digestion, and that's being released as feces. It's a combination of the two that we talk about with the term biodeposits. Next slide. And so one of the advances really over the last decade and a half to 2 is the ability to measure the process of denitrification. Denitrification is not the easiest thing to measure simply because when you think about gases dissolved in water, one of the highest concentrations of gases is N2. And so we're looking for the production of N2 against a huge background. And it's in the report, there's some description of how this is done. I'm not going to go into detail, other than the fact that advances are really in the last several to 3 decades have really allowed us to make these kinds of measurements when they would have been extremely difficult to do prior to that. When you think about looking at denitrification in different places, you need something to more or less normalize the rates to compare different reefs and different situations. And so we've settled on dry tissue weight, grams per square meter, as our metric for how many oysters or how much activity is going on there. And you can see there's a lot of noise in relationships. So what does this mean under dark conditions? And this is using dark data. You look at the oxygen, for instance. Well, more animals means more biodeposits plus their own respiration. They take up more oxygen. Negative values mean uptake. If you look at ammonium, there's a lot more ammonium being produced with more oysters, though that's highly variable. Same with nitrate. Again, these look a little bit messy, but this is the nature of bottom data of any kind. And if you look at dinitrogen, which we care about the most, you see there tends to be an increase with increasing biomass of oysters. And so the biomass in the bottom then becomes a key part of the assessment, not just making the measurements in terms of nitrogen removal, but in fact, it will tell us how the reef is doing over time, reevaluating biomass every 3 years or so. Can we keep a credit like this going if this is indeed credited? Next slide, please. So what do we need to have in place to think about quantifying and using denitrification from a management sense? Number one, it has to be qualifying enhancement activity. You can't just not harvest oysters that are there. We require some activity of placing oysters into the environment or placing shell that as they do in Virginia to allow a better set of oysters onto the bottom. It has to be non-harvest sites. Baseline biomass determined by an appropriate measure. Basically, you could measure prior to restoration, or you could find control areas that are equivalent sites that you can measure what was occurring, the equivalent before restoration. Biomass is determined by field surveys, default estimates. The reef must be subtidal and restored using small substrates only, and this is for the default rates. We also have the opportunity if individuals would like to go out and make measurements on their own particular system, that is allowable as well. We're only looking at live oyster tissue biomass, and post-restoration tissue biomass must exceed the baseline in all cases. Next slide. And so there's a stepwise determination of the effectiveness, identify the site, document the activity that enhanced the biomass of oysters, determine or choose a baseline approach. How much denitrification was there or is in equivalent sites. Determine, assess baseline and post-restoration biomass. And that is not a small task, and that requires certainly a lot of effort to keep that going. Determine denitrification enhancement per unit area, and determine total nitrogen removal attributable to enhanced denitrification. Next slide, please. So identifying the site, we don't care what the intent was in terms of restoration. We do care about how effective planting these spat on shell have been. Pretty much post implementation surveys are helpful, as well as a recording as the activities going on. Next slide, please. Document the qualifying enhancement activities, hatchery produced oysters and/or suitable substrate. I'll mention on the left-hand side, we're talking about smaller substrates, which would be the equivalent of what we see in our large-scale restoration Harris Creek and equivalent sites. There are also large substrate sites where oysters have been placed on reef balls and in shoreline structures to allow them to grow in that. In those cases, of course, it's only the small substrates that we have default rates for. The large substrates, there's data from my lab and others, and it suggests the rates are quite high on these structures. However, we don't have enough data to make a universal assessment of saying, here's a default rate for what these kinds of structures do. Next slide, please. The baseline approach. The panel spent a lot of time on this. This was a really key part of understanding this. My biomass measured at the BMP site within 2 years prior to restoration. So this is the pre-restoration biomass. And the second, like I was talking about before, is a representative site, non-restored site representative of that site within the same basin. And the data with this could be collected concurrent with the first post-restoration survey at the best management practice site. And so in practice, most of the data we generate have been the representative site approach. in other cases where there's a large restoration coming and there's the investment ahead of time, that could be done as well. Okay, next slide. Baseline and post-restoration biomass. We're going to follow this out over a number of years. How do we get to biomass? Well, you can always open up lots of oysters and dry them and do that, or you can use regressions we developed. This really was, the start to this was in our first report in 2016, where you can see there's almost 7,000 measurements that have gone into these regressions between shell height and tissue dry weight. And we're using different quantile regression numbers for that to do that. So you can do that through the default regression. You can do it through direct measurements and site-specific regressions. Next. Oh, can you go back one? And so there's lots of sites that have gone into this. I should mention that. And there are diploid and triploid values for these kinds of things that we've developed over time. And so this is not just from one or two of our favorite sites. This is really spread throughout the whole Chesapeake Bay region. Okay, next slide. And so the recommended approach is default estimates regarding the location. We'll show you how that's being used. These are relatively conservative estimates, we believe, that could be attributed to any restoration that's being put on the bottom in Chesapeake Bay. And then there are site-specific estimates in coordination with the state and the Chesapeake Bay program, using appropriate methods to come up with the rates for that specific place. Directly measuring denitrification, as I said, is challenging and potentially costly. So part of the rationale for the default estimates is that it would be too costly to really make these measurements everywhere all the time, and thus really would hinder the implementation. Denitrification rates are also related directly to oyster tissue biomass, as we've shown. Next one. And so we've looked at a lot of regressions. This is the work of mostly of Lisa Kellogg. This is combining data from Virginia and Maryland and looking at spring, summer, and fall subtidal numbers, and coming up with regressions that are useful in terms of calculating the default rate over a range of biomasses. Next slide, please. And there's a lookup table here. If you look at on the vertical axis, it says baseline oyster biomass range. And so we're looking at the top one being 0 to 14. So this is what was out there prior to restoration. If you look at the colored area post-restoration biomass, it's the same thing. So we've essentially included the baseline in this. And if you look at the numbers in the white area, it would account for what the default rate would be in pounds per acre per year of nitrogen removal. So for example, if we had a really low baseline oyster biomass range of 0 to 15 or so, and we had a really high biomass of in the restored areas, we'd have 186 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year removal. Okay. Next slide. Reporting guidelines. And so this is important because this needs to be implemented down the line by our state agencies. And so these are things that are really needed to come up with a whole program for crediting that's out there. So you need the site location and area. We need to know when things were planted, type of substrate, et cetera. You can read through a lot of these things: size of oysters at time of planting, baseline biomass at either the two different methods that we just described, and post-restoration biomass. We need to identify estimated denitrification enhancement, and that's related to either the default or if you're going out and do the specific measurements. Next slide, please. Unintended consequences. We haven't really, within the water quality realm, unintended consequences of restoration in subtidal oyster reefs are really not an issue that we've been able to come up with as having problems. So for instance, there's really, there's always an increase in net denitrification at the restoration site. The efficiency of their process is variable. Different restorations may have relative the amount of oxygen taken up, but different amounts of dinitrogen denitrification that's going on. Large substrates, we don't have enough data. There's tantalizing data suggesting these are really incredible places for this kind of removal, but more work needs to be done before there's sort of a generalized view of the kind of rates that you're going to find in these systems. Next slide. So this is the bottom line. The panel has determined that the process of denitrification in restored oyster reefs results in the net removal of nitrogen and should be included as a BMP. It fits in well with some denitrification and some other land-based BMPs, and is scientifically defensible because we've been able to get enough data to come up with the numbers for this. We decide, secondly, default rates or site-specific rates are both equivalent to us in terms of their value, in terms of including those removal rates in the BMP. For large substrates, crediting is only available for site-specific data. And anybody who wants to move forward on that can talk to a number of us who have done work in that area. And I think there's some opportunities there for both science and help with management. Next slide. And so this is the first part of our webinars. A week from today, at the same time, there's oyster assimilation protocols. There's that one is denitrification, because of the chemistry involved in it. Seems like it's complicated, but in some ways it's relatively straightforward because we're going to a restored reef and we have default rates that are defensible. In the case of the oyster assimilation, there's a lot of interesting pieces of that, and it's worth tuning in because it's not exactly like the first 2016 report. It's a little bit more complicated because we're not counting oysters in the same way and doing it in that simplified approach. So thanks for joining, and we will start answering any questions in the question and answer part of the program.
There is a question. Andrew Larkin from NOAA is asking, what substrate size is considered small?
Yeah, I can provide some more input on that. So there's a section in the report in chapter 7 that provides a really detailed definition of the different substrate sizes. So for just to summarize, essentially a small substrate is something that's going to be less than 12 inches in diameter and has an irregular structure. So the point of this is to say that these are substrates that if you have two oysters that are growing apart from each other, so for example are set on spat on shell and growing in opposite directions, that's generally the largest size that these small structures can really be. And this essentially captures kind of like the natural variability in what's already on these reefs. So fossilized oyster shell can also be considered a small substrate, small pieces of granite, small pieces of limestone marl. So anything that's less than 12 inches in diameter and irregular in structure. So that would exclude types of engineered structures such as like oyster castles. Those, since we don't have an understanding, like Jeff said, of the way that oysters grow on those substrates, or we don't have as good of an understanding of the way oysters grow on those substrates, we're lumping them with large structures for now because we need more information on those. So hopefully that answers your question.
There is another question. Allison Colden from Chesapeake Bay Foundation asks, would direct setting be considered an enhancement for purposes of denitrification crediting?
I assume that's introducing spat to structures in a shell. Is that?
I believe the reference is to introducing larvae directly to a
Right.
substrate inside tube, so in the water, rather than doing it the way that spat on shell is created.
In essence, that is what's happening in Virginia. So shell is being deployed there, and that's certainly part of this crediting our thoughts already and what's in the report. And so any activity that enhances oyster deployment is really what we're looking at in that mode. I think that whether nature provides the larvae or whether it's enhanced by say sealing in a portion and holding the larvae into that area to get that kind of enhancement. I think for our purposes, I think that would be equivalent.
Yeah. Okay, there's more questions coming in. Elizabeth River Project. The question is, do you need sample sites for reviewing large substrates like oyster castles to get the data you need? There are several sites on the Elizabeth River that could be used.
Yes, we though there's certainly we've generated in my lab a small amount of data. There are certainly people in Virginia capable of making equivalent measurements to the things we've done and identifying those sites and then finding sources of funding for the folks to go out and make those measurements is the second part of that.
Ken would like to respond to the previous question.
To the direct setting question?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and say that I think that the question of credit for the amount of larvae used in direct setting is going to be ambiguous. You know, we don't know what the settlement rates of those larvae are. So the only credit that could come from a direct setting method would be based on its success.
Right.
2 years down the road or something like that. I'm not aware of any data sets that have shown that direct larval application in the field results in a significant number of spat on the target structures, I guess I'd say. So I think that's just what I wanted to point out. In Virginia, the natural larvae are abundant and putting substrate out to catch those is great. That's not the case in Maryland, and unless we know a lot more about how successful direct setting is, I think it's going to be questionable to provide credit to it. That's all I've got.
Thanks, Ken.
Great. Thanks, Ken. There are more questions. This is more sort of in the science area for you, Jeff. Over time, the oyster, and this is from Tarig Omer. Over time, the oyster reef will eventually improve the bottom oxygen level and sediment layer. DO will, the sediment layer DO. Will the denitrification process still work in the absence of anaerobic sediment layer? Yeah,
there will always be because you're focusing. So you don't need to look so much at the water column. These are generally shallow environments, so there's always going to be plenty of oxygen within the water column. You do see some depletion as water flows over a reef and it's taken up, but it still remains quite high. There's the anaerobic areas needed for this. If it was a sediment, you'd say, you know, typical Chesapeake sediment, oxygen goes down only a few millimeters, and you have plenty of anaerobic conditions there. There's a limit to our science in terms of the exact processes of how this happens, and we move oyster clumps away from the substrate. We find a lot of the denitrification moves with it, and so there are anaerobic parts of the ecosystem that seem to be associated with the oysters and their shell. Potentially there seems to be some relationship to the number of polychaetes, though that's imperfect. So it's really a great topic of basic science. We're getting the net for the community and the approaches that we use, but there's an awful lot of science yet to come on that.
Great. There's another question from Eric Smith. This is actually a really good one, I think, to provide some clarification. He's also saying really good report and analysis to the panel. And he's wondering if it's possible to estimate uncertainty in the rates. Also, will you be giving guidelines? This is, I think, the important part of this, giving guidelines on study design and possible examples of analysis. Will there be a data repository to help future analysis?
Yes, and no. Well, I think actually, I mean, this has come up in a variety of ways. Let me talk about the data repository to help future analyses. Clearly, there needs to be a clearinghouse set up for this, because you know, we've based these default rates on what we have now, and the ability to adjust those in when there's more data out there would be extremely handy. There's questions about, you know, could we take data from North Carolina or Florida or other places and include that? But I think we've stuck with just Chesapeake data, generally with the same technique. In terms of the uncertainty in the rates, you know, the regressions have an uncertainty attached to them. It's my conviction that our rates for the default rates are really conservative. You know, more data would certainly help refine those, but I think if I had to make a more than an educated guess, that an awful lot of the rates are higher than what we're providing as guidance here. We do talk about how we did analyses and study design. There's a lot of that information. I think some of it's in the appendices. Certainly we can answer those questions offline for everybody, because your data is only as good as your study design, and you got to make sure you capture variability in nature. You need to have a range of conditions so that you can create regressions or at least compare site to site. And you know, I would argue that probably this whole field is not in its infancy, but we're really on our first round of understanding all this. There's more that can be done, I think, in the future to refine things.
Yeah, and I will add to Jeff's response. So regarding the sample design, there are several places throughout the report where we provide guidance on, you know, like what is acceptable from a scientific standpoint. There's some specific text in there that talks about what the panel recommends as like a minimum number of samples per acre. There's information about, you know, things that you should consider when you're designing your sampling protocol and all that. So refer to the report, but also definitely reach out if there are additional questions about how best to collect this data.
Great. Okay, the next question is from Tom Gay from the Severn River Association. In the Severn River, ORP, DNR, and Severn and SRA have been systematically planting spat on shell since 2018 on 6 restored oyster reefs. Will these efforts qualify for TMDO credit? So far, about 100 million spat on shell have been planted. So this is one of those implementation questions.
It's, if the biomass is available, you're in business.
Right. So I think that to answer that question, the panel has, recommended these rates based upon the supporting science. The implementation and the availability of biomass is really up to the implementers, in this case, likely the state and DNR to decide that one.
Right. But those kinds of projects are exactly the kind that we're looking to credit for this.
Here's a question from E. Nelson. Have you looked at how the Chesapeake Bay data compares with other geographic sites such as Connecticut, New York, or Massachusetts?
We've looked at all the data that we've been able to document. Massachusetts has a fair bit, both in aquaculture and restoration. The rates, there's a little bit of apples and oranges in the numbers that are out there, just in the sense that what we've done are community rates, meaning the whole smear of oysters, mussels. There's crabs. There's all sorts of animals that are attached to this, other filtering organisms. And so we make the measurements we're using typically are a community number, and a lot of the data that's out there would be, say, a core adjacent to a reef or components of the reef. And so there's some really good data in some of these places for the whole community. In some cases, really just kind of using techniques that I don't think account for an awful lot of the denitrification that's out there.
I will also add that all of the data that's included in these default rates is from subtidal reefs, at least for the denitrification component. So that's just another thing to think about. I know certain areas in New England have more intertidal reefs, and we don't have data on those from the Chesapeake Bay.
Right.
Okay, there's a couple more questions from Tom Gay. They're specific to whether the report has recommendations on how to assess biomass from future restoration, and then also specifics to strains of oysters that might have been planted in the Severn River, and whether they actually would be potentially credited.
Yeah. I mean, our focus is on performance of the reef that's on the bottom. So if you have a viable reef, and even in the next question with low salinity tolerance, we're looking at, I mean, these processes, we do not have, we have a bit of a salinity range in that measurements of say 10 parts per thousand up in Maryland, and values much higher down in Virginia that are included in the analysis. So we're not seeing systematic differences between those. So I don't think salinity is going to be an issue, but the what was the first part of that question? But we detail assessing areas for biomass. Yeah, that's the answer is, I don't think we're doing what you're asking. There's a report detail. We should assess these areas for biomass. But
so
yeah,
the same sort of sampling design considerations that the panel has provided in the report also apply to taking baseline data.
right.
But we definitely recommend several places throughout the report where the panel is providing recommendations based on the science. Anything that is about implementation and how to best capture or how to best quantify this biomass. There are many other opportunities to reach out to other groups to ask those questions as well. So there is guidance, but it's not providing a structure that you have to follow.
And in terms of natural reefs, which is always a question, we spent a lot of time years ago, Lisa Kellogg and I, thinking, okay, where can we go make these measurements in a place that's undisturbed, and we just didn't identify any that were left that were accessible to us.
Okay, there's a question from Greg Giesemann. Jeff, I know you said the sample size is small, but could you share the denitrification rates on the large substrate projects that you've already reviewed?
Yes,
So there you
send
go.
me an email.
Send Jeff an email. He'll get that to you. There is a question from Stephanie Westby from the NOAA Restoration Center in the Chesapeake Bay office. Is the crediting based on the placement of the substrate or oysters in the water, or on the documented result success of the practice?
Yeah, it's the biomass assessment after they're planted. If all the oysters were to die in the first 6 months, we would be not crediting anything.
Stephanie also has her hand raised. I don't know if there was an additional question to that, or if that was just to ask that question, if we want to allow her to unmute herself.
Sure.
Sure, Stephanie. Not sure the process to do that. Is that
I think
Allison?
Allison.
Okay, Allison, could you unmute Stephanie? Stephanie, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. The reason I asked that was related to the conversation that Allison and Ken were having around direct setting. I guess, although it's not been specified as a technique, if you have an oyster reef with substrate and you come back out, however many years later and document an increase of biomass, whether they got there from natural recruitment or because somebody dropped larvae on them, I would think that would be able to be credited. Do you think that's a correct interpretation?
I think if you're deploying shells specifically to attract those larvae, that's an activity. If it was the shell was there from something else or its relic shell, I don't think that's sufficient activity to be counted, even if you. But direct setting is direct setting. I mean, if you can document an increased biomass of oysters with any of these activities, it seems like that does fit into the mold.
Okay, we're not quite there yet, as Ken pointed out, although we did publish a paper yesterday that I'll post in the chat. Thank you.
Mark Luckenbach has his hand raised as well.
Yeah, let's
Mark.
let's unmute Mark.
Mark, are you?
He is
Can you hear us?
our Virginia sage.
Luckenbach from the panel. Can you unmute him, Allison, please?
Am I
Oh.
think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Gotcha. Go for it.
Yeah. Mine was just a follow-up answer to the question regarding the limited data on large pieces of substrate. What I think that I want people to understand is that the issue isn't just that there's a little bit of data. It's the data that exists when you have large substrates is not the community denitrification data that Jeff was talking about. The role, it really appears that the role of the oysters here, and broadly speaking in this, is not only to bring organic nitrogen to the bottom through biodeposition, but greatly increasing the surface area with all the et cetera nooks and crannies and that gives so much more surface availability for denitrification to take place. So the challenge is not to simply get more numbers from oysters that you peel off of a large piece of substrate. It's how to accurately figure out what the actual rate would be on that type of substrate.
We've moved a lot of pieces of the large substrate into tanks to do the measurements, and in some ways get a community measurement. But what's missing also is that their impact isn't just on the structure itself, but it can have an impact on the sediments adjacent to it as well. And so there's a lot to be done to get to a full accrediting. The sediments could be a negative component to it. just because you can overload them with biodeposits. Even if you see a lot of denitrification on the large substrate. A lot of science yet to do on that.
Okay, great. Move on. There's a question from Kristen Saunders from UMSES and EPA, I believe. I want to, open, I think this is a good one for potential panel members to also, help address if possible. So the question is, if approved as a BMP, how would this compare to other BMPs in terms of crediting? Can you reference comparable BMPs just to give it the context of how many or how much credit we might be talking about comparatively? So I'm not sure the panel certainly didn't really go into this evaluating that part of the equation, but I don't know if there's anybody.
I mean, on a per acre basis, no, we haven't done that to go back to what's being credited for denitrification in other situations, non-tidal marshes, and maybe edge of field type numbers for that. So that's not that hard to do. We just haven't done that. And so I started thinking about that question rather late in the game here, and I think it's certainly something that matters. One of the questions that always comes up is can we deploy enough oysters to fundamentally change eutrophication in the Chesapeake Bay? And I think talking with Lou Linker and our colleagues, our emphasis is we want to remove nutrient everywhere all the time, and that this is another tool in the toolbox, but it's not the only tool left. That we need everything in order to really change the trajectory of the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, I'm going to move on then. Another question from Terry Gomer. What is the time frame for the report to be finalized and approved by state agencies and used by local municipalities for nutrient reduction credits?
Based on our experience with the first report, we'd be looking at the BMP yay or nay being early summer. In terms of the state agencies, it's really it's a matter of when they have the resources to really turn this into policy. And the first at least in Maryland I can speak to, it was a solid year or 18 months before the really things were coming out from our Maryland Department of the Environment towards incorporating biomass, the nitrogen and phosphorus from aquaculture into policy. And even that is taking a bit of time, and it's being revised continually. So it's an ongoing process, but I would anticipate it would take a year or two for the agencies to really implement this.
Okay, one last question again from Tom Gay of Severn River Association. What is the best way to verify oyster biomass from spout and shell planting on our restoration reefs? Is diving, I think, is method is what.
Yeah, so Tom, I would encourage you to reach out to the Oyster BMP response email. That's going to come directly to me, and we can definitely continue this conversation offline if that's helpful for you. But the panel is recommending whatever ways are scientifically robust and to provide like statistically robust data to use. So that's a vague response, but I'm happy to continue that conversation as needed.
And I would say you're talking to the right people because they've been thinking about this a lot.
Yes.
To assess the success of restored oyster reefs.
Stephanie Westby has also provided a link to a recently published paper related to direct setting. There's also a question again from the Elizabeth River project host asking for Jeff's email. What I would suggest is maybe follow up with the BMP email that Olivia just referred to, asking for Jeff's email, and we'll work it that way.
Yep, that'd be great. I'm glad to answer questions offline or online in any direction. Yeah. This has been for this panel, it's been a big part of our lives for more than half a decade. So we're anxious to talk and solve all problems associated with it now.
I don't see any more questions.
All right, thank you, everybody. I guess I'll give the other BMP panel members the floor if there's anything that they would like to add to this conversation that we've been having this morning. So panelists, I don't know if any of you want to jump in and add to anything we've talked about. Okay.
Okay,
Well, with that, thank you all for tuning in and listening, and thank you very much to the BMP panel members who have also attended and supported our Q&A session here. So this talk was recorded and our conversations were recorded. We'll be working internally to get that link posted over the next couple days. So you can find that on the Bay Program webpage or events calendar page for this talk. I also want to turn your attention again to our next webinar, which will be held next Tuesday at the same time, 11 a.m. We'll be talking about the other two components of this new report. So please tune in and please submit any additional questions with your written feedback to the email at the bottom of the screen here, oysterbmpresponse@oysterrecovery.org. All right, thank you very much, everybody.
thank you.